You've probably heard that avoidants run from closeness, fear intimacy, and struggle to stay connected in relationships. But what if I told you there's one specific type of person they can't resist? A type that disarms them, calms their defenses, and pulls them in without chasing, over-explaining, or emotionally over-functioning. I'm Jim Rohn, and in this video we're diving deep into the surprising psychology behind who avoidants are actually drawn to and why. Because it's not who most people think. If you've ever been in a push-pull dynamic with an avoidant where you give more, try harder, only to be met with emotional distance, you know how exhausting it can be. You might think being more available or more loving will finally break down their walls. But here's the truth. Avoidants aren't attracted to emotional intensity, they're drawn to emotional safety. And ironically, that safety is often found in someone who isn't anxiously pursuing them, but rather someone who understands emotional space, respects autonomy, and speaks their language of calm presence. Today, I'll show you how this dynamic works, why even the most avoidant person can feel magnetically pulled toward this type, and what this means if you're trying to build or rebuild a connection with someone who tends to pull away. We'll talk about the one attachment style that avoids emotional chaos while still offering quiet connection, and why this is what gets under an avoidant's skin in the best way. So if you've ever felt confused, rejected, or shut out by someone with avoidant patterns, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell so you never miss a future video, and drop a comment to share your experience. You're not too much. You might just be approaching them in a way their system wasn't built to receive. Let's dive in and talk about the one kind of connection avoidants can't resist. Here's where it gets interesting. Most people assume avoidants are drawn to anxious partners because the dynamic is so common. And sure, we see it a lot. The anxious partner chases, overfunctions, seeks reassurance. The avoidant pulls away, protects space, and tries not to feel consumed. It's a painful, often unstable loop. But what most don't realize is that avoidants are often more naturally drawn to other avoidants, especially to those with a fearful avoidant attachment style. Now, let's break this down simply. A dismissive avoidant tends to suppress emotions, keep people at a distance, and pride themselves on independence. A fearful avoidant, on the other hand, also struggles with emotional closeness, but they tend to crave it just as much as they fear it. That means they might pull away, but they're also capable of reaching out again, sometimes even with more emotional insight. And this creates a very particular kind of chemistry. Why does this work? Because they speak a shared emotional language. Avoidants often get overwhelmed by emotional intensity, especially the kind that comes with anxious partners. Emotional pursuit can feel like pressure. Overcommunication can feel like suffocation. But with another avoidant, particularly a fearful one, communication is more measured, emotionally distant, and non-demanding. And that creates a sense of safety. Picture this. A dismissive man who hates being put on the spot emotionally meets a woman who also doesn't want to talk about every feeling in real time. She gives space. She's used to withdrawing when things get too intense, so she doesn't push. Instead, she offers soft check-ins or shows care through actions more than words. Suddenly, he's not flooded. He doesn't feel trapped. He feels understood. This is what makes the dynamic magnetic. There's less emotional pressure and more mutual respect for space. They each intuitively understand that connection can come in quieter ways through consistency, subtle presence, or calm physical closeness, rather than verbal intensity. That kind of rhythm is soothing for avoidants. It doesn't threaten their autonomy or trigger their emotional defenses. That doesn't mean the relationship is conflict-free. But even their conflicts tend to be handled with emotional restraint rather than emotional escalation. They don't chase. They don't demand immediate resolution. If things get tense, they step back, and that's actually what makes reconnection possible. The space doesn't rupture the bond, it resets it. So if you've ever felt like someone avoidant was more open with a person who wasn't even trying that hard, this is often why. It's not about effort, it's about energy. And avoidants are naturally drawn to people who give them room to breathe, but still show up quietly, consistently, and without pressure. One of the most fascinating things about a relationship between two avoidants, especially a dismissive avoidant and a fearful avoidant, is how naturally they fall into a rhythm of balanced space and subtle connection. In a world that often glorifies constant communication and over-the-top affection, this kind of dynamic looks quiet, even distant to outsiders. But for the people inside it, it can feel surprisingly safe. Unlike anxious partners who often need emotional closeness and constant reassurance to feel secure, Both dismissive and fearful avoidant types have a built-in respect for autonomy. They need space to breathe, to reset, to feel like they're not being consumed by another person's emotional needs. And in this pairing, that space is not only allowed, it's understood. No one's chasing. No one's accusing the other of being too much or too cold. The emotional pace is slow, respectful, and most importantly, mutually regulated. Think of it like two islands in the same ocean. They're not trying to merge or live on top of each other. But there's a bridge, a quiet, intentional connection that they both use to check in, return, and stay linked. That bridge doesn't collapse when one pulls back a little. It doesn't demand 24/7 traffic. It simply exists, and for avoidance, that's exactly the kind of emotional connection that feels safe. I remember a story from a client named Daniel. He was a classic dismissive avoidant, hardworking, emotionally independent, not great with verbal affection. Then he met Leah, a fearful avoidant. Their relationship didn't start with fireworks or endless texting. In fact, there were long pauses between conversations. But when they did talk, it was thoughtful and calm. She never pushed. He never ghosted. Over time, without pressure, they both started to show up more. When Daniel forgot a plan, Leah didn't panic. When Leah had an emotional day and needed time alone, Daniel didn't interpret it as rejection. They just got it. That mutual space became the soil where trust could actually grow. This isn't to say the relationship was effortless. Fearful avoidants still have anxiety under the surface. Dismissive avoidants still default to emotional suppression. But because neither partner flooded the other, they had room to observe, breathe, and come back. That's something avoidants rarely experience with anxious partners, who often require more emotional closeness than they can sustainably offer. This balance of space and connection isn't about avoiding intimacy. It's about creating conditions where intimacy doesn't feel like a threat. And when both people speak that unspoken language, a sense of calm emerges, like finally, someone who doesn't need to own me to love me. So if you're wondering why an avoidant seems drawn to someone who doesn't seem overly invested, it's likely because that person is giving them what they rarely find: space without emotional abandonment. And for avoidants, that kind of connection is magnetic. Here's where things really start to click for many avoidant individuals. Emotional safety isn't just about being loved, it's about being understood without being overwhelmed. And for avoidants, especially dismissive types, one of the hardest dynamics to manage is with an anxious partner who constantly needs reassurance, connection, and verbal closeness. Over time, that can feel like pressure, even when it's coming from a good place. This is why avoidants often feel a surprising sense of relief when they connect with someone who shares a similar emotional rhythm, especially a fearful avoidant. With another avoidant, there's no pressure to respond immediately. No expectation to be emotionally available 24/7. If someone pulls back for a day or two, it's not instantly read as abandonment, it's just space. And that mutual understanding builds what they rarely get in other relationships: emotional safety through familiarity. Picture two people who both know what it feels like to need space in order to feel safe. They may not always say, "Hey, I need a moment," but they show it in their behavior. And the beauty of this kind of match is that the other person doesn't take it personally. That alone reduces 90% of the tension that would otherwise build in anxious avoidant dynamics. I worked with a woman named Erin, who was a fearful avoidant in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant man named Josh. Both had their walls. Both had been in past relationships where they felt misunderstood and emotionally pushed. But with each other, something felt different. Erin said, "When I needed time alone, he didn't ask if I was mad. He just gave it to me. And when he disappeared for a day, I didn't panic, I just let him come back when he was ready." That mutual emotional pacing felt like home, not because it was perfect, but because it was familiar. And that's the real key here. Avoidants are drawn to people who don't interpret space as rejection. It helps them relax into the connection rather than resist it. With an anxious partner, every need feels like a test. With another avoidant, especially a fearful one who understands emotional complexity, the relationship starts to feel less like a battlefield and more like neutral ground. Now, this doesn't mean it's without challenges. Fearful avoidants can still struggle with trust, and dismissive avoidance can still shut down. But the absence of constant emotional pressure gives both individuals more room to breathe, reflect, and re-engage on their terms. And that's when true emotional connection, slow, safe, and real, has a chance to develop. So if you're wondering why an avoidant person seems to come alive around someone who also has avoidant tendencies, it's likely because that person offers something rare: emotional space without emotional absence. And in the world of avoidant attachment, that kind of safety is incredibly hard to resist. Here's something you might not expect, but it's powerful. When two avoidant people, especially a dismissive avoidant and a fearful avoidant, come together, their connection can actually create a rare path to emotional growth. Now, this may sound counterintuitive. How could two people who fear or avoid intimacy help each other grow emotionally? The answer lies in one simple, but often overlooked, truth. They respect each other's emotional boundaries without judgment, and that, in itself, creates the space where healing can happen. Let's start with the dismissive avoidant, who usually values autonomy above all. They often grew up in environments where vulnerability was unsafe or even punished, so they learned to rely on themselves, suppress emotion, and avoid dependency. On the other hand, the fearful avoidant often had chaotic or inconsistent emotional experiences. They crave love and closeness but are terrified of being hurt or abandoned. So they constantly teeter between pulling close and pushing away. At first, both may seem emotionally distant or even disinterested, but that's just their defense mechanisms doing the talking. Over time, what starts to shift is the emotional rhythm they create together. Unlike in an anxious avoidant pairing, where one is always chasing and the other retreating, two avoidants tend to give each other breathing room, and that breathing room lowers defenses. Take, for example, a client of mine named Jasmine, a fearful avoidant woman who entered a relationship with a man named Eric, a classic dismissive avoidant. In the beginning, both were guarded, texts were sporadic. Neither liked relationship talks. But here's what changed things. Jasmine started noticing that Eric didn't demand anything from her. He never flooded her emotionally. Instead, he gave her space to come toward him. And because she didn't feel emotionally cornered, she started to open up slowly, cautiously, but consistently. Meanwhile, Eric, who usually shut down in the face of emotional needs, began to feel less threatened by Jasmine's emotional world. She didn't pressure him or criticize him when he needed solitude. She didn't make his silence mean something about her worth. And that quiet acceptance allowed him to start showing up more. He began initiating more often. He asked how she was feeling. He even began sharing things about his own childhood that he had never told a partner before. What was happening here? Emotional growth born from emotional pacing. Each person felt emotionally safe not because the other person changed them, but because their needs weren't constantly challenged or triggered. Over time, the dismissive avoidant began to access deeper emotional availability, and the fearful avoidant, usually anxious and reactive, began to feel more emotionally secure and stable. That's the magic of two avoidants who connect in a conscious way. Instead of spiraling in emotional chaos, they find a kind of quiet stability. And that stability allows for trust to build not fast, but deeply. They begin to have hard conversations in low-pressure ways. They learn to sit with discomfort instead of reacting to it. And they start to realize that intimacy doesn't have to cost them their independence or emotional safety. Of course, this isn't always a fairy tale. Both people still need to be aware of their patterns. Growth doesn't happen just by accident. It happens when both people are willing to slowly lower their armor. But unlike with anxious avoidant pairings, where one person often ends up emotionally depleted, avoidant connections offer a slower but more balanced dance toward intimacy. So yes, avoidants often find unexpected emotional growth not with anxious partners, or even with those who try to fix them, but with someone who lets them be, who moves at a similar emotional pace, and who offers connection without pressure. That's where their defenses start to soften. That's where attachment begins to feel safe. And that's why this kind of bond, though quiet, can be incredibly profound. Another reason avoidants are often drawn to other avoidants, particularly in the dynamic between a dismissive avoidant and a fearful avoidant, is how conflict gets handled. Unlike anxious avoidant pairings, which can spiral into emotional escalation and blame, avoidant-avoidant dynamics tend to lean toward logic over emotion during conflict. That's not to say they're masters of communication, but they naturally avoid one thing that usually makes arguments worse: emotional flooding. Let's be honest, many dismissive avoidants shut down when emotions run high. And fearful avoidants, while more likely to engage emotionally, often feel unsafe during heated moments, especially when conflict threatens the bond. So instead of explosive arguments or long, emotionally intense breakdowns, this duo tends to handle conflict with space, reflection, and a surprising amount of calm. They step back, cool off, and then, when ready, talk it through without needing an emotional blow-by-blow. This often looks like what I call a soft reset. For example, Natalie, a fearful avoidant, was dating Marcus, a dismissive avoidant. They had an argument about something small, weekend plans falling through, but instead of escalating or spiraling into accusations, Marcus went quiet. Normally, this would trigger panic in a more anxiously attached partner. But Natalie, used to space and withdrawal herself, didn't chase. She let him have that silence. And 2 days later, Marcus messaged her a thoughtful voice note. "I've been thinking. I wasn't fair to you on Friday. Can we talk?" No drama, no stonewalling, just space and clarity. Because both avoidant types dislike emotional chaos, they're more likely to resolve tension using logic, timing, and non-reactive dialogue. They don't force immediate resolution, which for many avoidants actually helps them process internally and come back to the relationship with more presence. Conflict becomes something to navigate, not something to fear. Of course, the downside here is that deep emotional processing may still be avoided, especially if both partners are overly reliant on logic. That's why a bit of intentional effort is needed to check in emotionally and not just skate past hurt. But even then, the baseline of emotional calm provides a foundation that feels safe, especially for people who've historically been overwhelmed by relational stress. What this all comes down to is this: in avoidant dynamics, conflict isn't avoided, it's de-intensified. And for people whose nervous systems interpret emotional demand as danger, that's not just a relief, it's a relationship lifeline. Let's bring everything full circle. Avoidants aren't afraid of love. What they fear is emotional chaos, feeling smothered, misunderstood, or emotionally cornered. That's why their behavior often looks like withdrawal, indifference, or resistance, when in reality, it's a defense mechanism designed to protect their nervous system from overwhelm. But when they connect with someone who honors their need for space, speaks in calm emotional tones, and moves at a slower, more grounded pace, that's when something powerful happens. Throughout this video, we explored why avoidants are often drawn not to anxious or secure partners, but to other avoidants, especially those who carry a mix of avoidance and emotional depth, like fearful avoidants. These dynamics work because they share a mutual understanding of boundaries. They don't push each other into vulnerability. They let each other choose when to open up. And it's through that respect and space that trust begins to build. We talked about how dismissive and fearful avoidants offer each other emotional breathing room, how their communication feels direct but not demanding, how they handle conflict with logic rather than intensity, and how over time they can actually help each other grow. The dismissive opens up, the fearful stabilizes. Both begin to experience a kind of connection that doesn't sacrifice autonomy or emotional safety. So if you're watching this and thinking, maybe I've been trying to connect in a way that overwhelms them, or now I understand why they seemed more present with someone else, don't blame yourself. Understanding the psychology behind avoidant attraction empowers you to approach your relationships with more clarity, compassion, and confidence. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you seen this dynamic play out in your own relationships? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And if you found this video helpful, be sure to subscribe, tap the notification bell so you never miss another insight, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. Remember, you don't need to chase love. Real connection doesn't demand you abandon yourself, it invites you to show up as you are. And for avoidance, that's the kind of love that lasts.